Hey guys, how you doing? How you doing? Great. I have rebelled and I've come dressed as David Bowie. I hope that's fine with everyone. Stephen, okay with you?
Amazing, you look incredible. 40 quid, that outfit.
40 quid, Portobello Market. So, we have got a lot to talk about today. Obviously, we've had the opportunity to chat on mic and off mic over the years, and we're extremely interested in very similar subjects. And one subject I'm sure you're coming across more and more, which is something I certainly have over the last few years, is that combination of mental health and business, or mental health in the workplace. And that certainly wasn't a conversation we were having 5, 10 years ago. Why do you think we're seeing a surge in the need for that chat?
I think the world has changed irreversibly in so many ways over the last 10, 20 years, and I spend so much time sitting with psychologists, and yesterday with a great neuroscientist that's highlighting the changes that have occurred in the world, the loss of community, the decline in purposelessness, which is only going to be accelerated over the next decade or two with artificial intelligence and our need to seek out new ways to conduct our lives and work. And also more broadly, when I think about community and connection, which really should be at the very bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs because they're fundamental to our feeling of stability, we're seeing a macro decline in that. If you ask an American the question, how many people have you got to turn to in a time of crisis 20 years ago, the medium answer is 3. You ask the Americans that question today, the medium answer is now 0. So workplaces are inadvertently now having to do a little bit more work as it relates to community, connection, and emotional support than they would have had to do 10 or 20 years ago. And I remember one particular study on the subject matter of stress, which I write about in a chapter which I called Make Pressure Your Privilege, where they interview people who are undergoing significant life events. So it could be a death in the family or something really adverse, or something horrific that happens at work, being fired or something like that. And you're 30% more likely to die in the coming year of all-cause mortality if something bad happens in your life, unless you have a supportive community around you. Then your chance of dying through that stressful incident is significantly less. And I can go through all of these studies. The TLDR of it is that work is now being expected to lift more of the responsibility of wellness than it was expected to in a world we used to live in. And I think that's something to think about. It's a huge advantage for employers, though, because the thing that keeps staff retained and focused, and most importantly, maybe engaged with the mission, are those things. It comes back to mental wellness. If you're thinking from a bottom-of-the-line perspective, if your team members have a sense of forward motion, if they feel challenged, if they have a high degree of personal autonomy, they have that psychological safety which Google have famously reported on, if they have subjective meaning in the work they're doing, and most importantly of all, if they're surrounded by a supportive group of people they like, they will be engaged. And this is a kind of a side point, because one of the most frequent questions people DM me about is, how do I find my purpose in life, or how do I find my passion? It's become pretty clear to me that it's an unuseful question to ask. It assumes that, like an Easter egg, your passion is something you have to go in search of and that it is a singular. But also, what I've come to learn is that it's about the core components of the work you're doing, that psychological safety, that sense of connection, irrespective of industry. Then it will feel like your passion.
It's a really tricky one, isn't it? Because like you say, there's some fundamentals there that businesses and workspaces can help to cultivate that for their staff. But at the end of the day, you can't force anyone to do anything. And if you've got staff working for you, teams working with you, and there's an individual or individuals that aren't happy, I feel like sometimes the responsibility gets tipped, and there shouldn't be sole responsibility on the employer to fix everybody's mental health. Certainly, I think it's important to look at the fundamentals, the basics in place, but you can't force someone to get therapy, do meditation, whatever it might be. There's got to also be accountability and responsibility from the individual. So it's a sweet spot you've got to reach, I guess.
Yeah, and that's the same in our personal relationships. You can't, if there's someone who's your best friend or a relative of yours, again, psychologists and therapists and psychiatrists on my podcast always say that being a fixer actually often doesn't help. What they want is, and this is supported by the studies, again, the stress study I talked about, is encouraging talking about it helps it significantly. I was reading about a study on stress which shows that if you're undergoing a stressful situation in work and you're not feeling great, and they looked at this through the lens of studies they did in laboratories, that exists in the amygdala of the brain, which is the emotional center. If you just ask someone to vocalize what they're feeling and why they're feeling it, it moves it to the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with logic, which essentially means it kind of diffuses the stress just by getting your team members to talk about it. So we don't have to be fixers, but we can be an open book in terms of encouraging conversation and normalizing the conversation in the workplace, and then having channels where those conversations can be addressed professionally.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good bit of advice. Like personally, I had a big period of lots of panic attacks, and I haven't, touch wood, had one for a while now. And I know what my triggers are, and I know where it all stems from. But if I was in a situation where I felt, oh, this could be a moment where one's going to surface, if I said it out loud, it would diffuse it. So I found it very difficult to drive on the motorway, and I was doing some filming and asked to go and do a long ride on an A road. It wasn't even a motorway. And I thought, God, this is going to be horrendous and potentially mortifying if I have to stop filming because I'm having a panic attack. So before we even started, I just said, look, by the way, I have panic attacks. I might have one because it's a bit of a trigger for me. And because I'd said it and I was sort of supported and listened to in that, that situation, I didn't have one. It instantly takes the edge off of it.
Yeah, and from a neuroscience perspective, it moved from one part of your brain, the amygdala, to the prefrontal cortex. So your perspective and how your brain was dealing with that completely changes. And that's why it's so important just to have channels for vocalization, because you can move something from the emotional center, which can really eat up at us, to a more logical center where we're kind of looking at it. It's kind of like holding the controller versus being in the game.
Yeah.
You can, if you vocalize the thing, you start to hold the controller. When it's unvocalized, you're inside the screen, inside the game.
And I think also the brilliant thing is as soon as you say something out loud, like certainly when I started talking more publicly, but also just in my close circles about panic attacks, the amount of my mates that said, why didn't you tell me? I've been having them for years. Or even friends that I would look to who, like I've got friends in their 70s who I thought are solid as a rock. And they'd say, oh my God, at your age, I was having them all the time for overwhelm reasons. And you feel like you're not so alone in it, which is another great basic sort of tool to have to realize that there is that sense of connection and togetherness when you're going through something.
And that's supported again by the science. So in those moments of shared struggle, oxytocin levels rise in our bodies.
Yeah.
And when we think about hormones and chemicals in our bodies, we kind of think that we experience them. But if you've ever looked at the studies around how women that live in close proximity or work in close proximity will have their menstrual cycles synchronized, the same applies for both stress and oxytocin. It actually leaks through the pores of our skin through sweat. So they've shown in studies that stress is literally contagious, because if you come in a close proximity of someone that's stressful, you will pick up their cortisol. And the same applies for oxytocin. So when we share our struggle, when an earthquake strikes or something bad happens in our life, we're literally, physiologically, and from a neuroscience perspective, bringing people closer to us. And it drops down the walls of ego, and it makes us feel more connected and bonding. This is also why they say when you have a newborn baby, why skin-to-skin contact is so important, because the hormones are leaking through our body. And the bonding hormone, oxytocin, is one of them that will leak through your body when you share your struggle with somebody else. And it goes back to what we said, that bonding, that sense of connection is physiological. It's in the air. It's a hormone and a chemical. So
yeah, and we forget that because, by the way, ladies, we're all going to start menstruating together after today, or watch out. But it is so interesting because society tells us a lot of the time, we're on our own, you're on your own, you better be the best, or you better, move in your lane. And actually, we have to get back to thinking in a communal sense that we are all connected and there is that unity. I think we've just wiped that off the face of the earth, and it's not good.
it's not, but it's become part of culture's sort of narrative that you grow up and you kind of stand on your own 2 feet, or you grow up and you take on life alone. But we're always, again, I just think about all the conversations I've had with leading neuroscientists and psychologists who speak back through the lens of our tribes. We are born to be in tribes, and we're wired in such a way that if anything threatens our sense of being in a tribe, we have these adverse physiological reactions and disease, and we go into this state of what they call self-preservation. If you imagine being in a tribe 10,000 years ago and you lost your tribe, your body would have to physiologically adapt to keep you alive. You wouldn't be able to sleep well because now you're just two pairs of eyes looking for lions. And all of those things, stress goes up, cortisol goes up, we sleep worse, we have more chance of disease, we become less nice to people. That's a really interesting finding in the studies, that you become mean when you're lonely. And you probably know this, a really interesting observation you would have had as a podcaster, is when you sit in a podcast with somebody and they open up with you, I walk out of the room and I just want to go do charity work or something. I just want to help everybody I encounter.
Yeah.
The barista I encounter, I'm giving huge tips. And that's, again, because of the psychology of bonding.
Yeah.
And it makes us nicer and, more sort of psychologically safe.
Yeah, it was a beautiful thing. We were having this chat mere moments ago behind this black drape, talking about how lucky we feel to get to sit with people and have those in-depth conversations, and how actually, yes, you want to do your research and you want to learn something about the other person, but you do come away feeling boosted on every level, and it's a real privilege. I mean, on that note, obviously we both spend a hell of a lot of time quizzing other people about their own well-being, mental health, state of play at any one time. How is your mental health at the moment?
Yeah, I think about it a lot, as you can imagine. The balance that I've had over the years has been trying to avoid loneliness in the pursuit of success. And in the early phase of my career, I really got that balance wrong. Through shame and insecurity, I over-prioritized success in whatever subjective measurement you want to define that, at the cost of something else, which was at the cost of connections in my life or relationships or speaking to my family. At the times I went, although my mum really wasn't speaking to me for dropping out of university, I'd go for 6 months without talking to my family, months and months on end. And I'd work 7 days a week in that office. Even when I didn't have anything to do, I'd just go there because I didn't really have any friends. And at some point I felt this subtle emptiness in my chest that was building. And fortunately, around 25 years old, I conducted a bit of a reprioritization of my life and realized that in any pursuit that you plan to be successful at, you're probably going to have to prioritize consistency over intensity. You're probably going to have to go multi-decade, even in podcasting. So what I need to do is set up all of my professional systems, my businesses, my investments, my podcast, in a way where they're built for decades. So in a way where not just me, but all of my team members can move through the phases of life without deprioritizing things that are innately important to human well-being and happiness. They can have kids, they can become mothers and fathers, they can move country and houses, build a system in such a way, and then I'll be sustainably happy. And I don't have to do that, intensity versus consistency thing. I can be consistently sustainable. And so right now that's where I am, where I'm in a great relationship, been in that relationship now for 4 years, in touch with my family, some of which work in my companies now. I feel like I've got a sustainable balance in my life. This doesn't mean that I don't have moments where I feel anxious and I don't have all of those things, but now I've got a sustainable lifestyle. And we don't talk about that enough as entrepreneurs because there is a prevailing narrative, which maybe I've propagated because it was the way I conducted my early years, that you have to go really intense and sacrifice everything. And I think in hindsight, as we all know, to become a master in any pursuit that you're pursuing, you have to do it for a long enough time. And to do it for a long enough time, you have to build sustainability into the design of the system.
Which kind of goes against the grain of, I think, again, how we work on a societal level, where everything is quick. I want it today. I want it yesterday. And you're actually talking about a much more slow burn. I wonder do you think that success can exist without sacrifice or without loss of something else? Because I certainly mull this one over all the time. Every time I choose to work on an evening, I'm missing putting my kids to bed, for instance, or anytime I take on a new exciting job, I might be missing out, again, more family time or, reading to my kids, picking them up from school. And I constantly wonder, what is the balance here? How do I navigate? I'm ambitious, I want to do well, but I also want to be a really decent present parent and be a big, big part of raising my kids. I think it's a really hard balance to get.
I think we do ourselves such a disservice in the language that we use in our lives, because the language we use, and I sat again with a neuroscientist yesterday who was talking to me about the impact of language, and it was so unbelievably profound what she was saying to me, how language alone, get this, but she was saying to me how in the studies they've done, if people just think about, this is going to sound like absolute craziness, right? The neuroscientist is called Dr. Tara. If people just think about exercise, and they put them in these studies where they just think about exercise over and again, and they imagine themselves lifting these weights, they saw a 13% increase in muscle mass, just by the thoughts that we mull over. And then she showed me all these studies on words and languages. It's clear to me that the language we use causes most of our problems. So in this case, I said it earlier, find your passion. Are you in love? So the issue with are you in love is it means that I have to force myself into a binary yes or no outcome, and also I have to define the word love and then see if I can yes or no it. Love, I love my dog, I love peanut butter. So if my mum asks me, do you love her? It forces me to struggle with this definition of love and then give my mum a yes or no answer. Better questions to ask ourselves in life are
I
questions
hope you
like,
said yes.
well, a better question to ask would be, how do you feel about her?
Yeah.
It opens up the door to nuance. And the reason I'm saying this is because in the words there, I saw so many, you said balance. What is balance?
Don't know.
Exactly. So it's like, it doesn't feel like a useful frame to think through. And many of the other words used there, like being a decent parent. What decent parent?
Again.
By whose measure?
Yeah.
So all of these words, what I would do, instead of trying to answer them or fit into them, I would reject them. And then I'd ask myself a set of better open questions. And I'm surrounded by people and myself who are plagued by trying to fit into these binary boxes, which it's just a bad way to live, but it's the way we communicate. It's the fault of language.
Yeah. And we're trying to figure out who we are, so we put ourselves in those boxes too. By the way, never going to the gym ever again.
That's what I said to her. I was like, what, 13?
I'm just going to do make-believe gym and be
Yeah.
like super buff.
Read about the study. It's so wild.
I am.
Crazy.
It's outrageous. Going back to the beginning of your entrepreneurial work, obviously building a company and at that point being so focused on what you believed was the ascent and the final destination, of course, and we've talked about this on my podcast, the stress that you endured when things did go wrong or there were some major disasters that you've shared over the years building that business along the road to success. How did you navigate that stress? You've talked about stress here on off quite a bit already because we all know it is a hot topic. Stress is something we're all dealing with on extreme levels and we shouldn't be. We shouldn't be feeling this stress that we are daily. And there will obviously be huge moments in life that cause us all detrimental stress, but I think a lot of the time it's the everyday momentum of trying to get somewhere on time and answering emails. It's all the teeny things that have this horrible sort of low hum of stress constantly. How did you navigate it and how do you deal with it today?
Yeah, so I'll talk about stress generally, then I'll bring it into the lens of my own life. So stress when it happens like this is not a huge issue. The stress you've described, which is the chronic stress, is where all the health outcomes that are unpleasant and unwanted occur. That's what they call chronic stress. That leads to the inflammation, which is, as most of you will know, one of the biggest killers and one of the biggest causes of most disease. So you want to avoid living a life where you're in this state of chronic stress. And it's funny because, again, I had a big conversation about stress with someone who studies it from a scientific perspective. And the big learning I got from a corporate entrepreneur standpoint is that stress, obviously, we know it's contagious. It comes down in organizations. But it leaks through your skin. And the second thing is, when CEOs hear that, when they look at the studies that show stress in an organization coming down from the leader is the most contagious, they just think, fine, I won't share my emotions and I won't show my stress. But if you understand that it's not something you're showing, it's literally coming through your skin, it means that you have to address the root cause of the issue. And for me, I had many stressful incidents. The one I talk a lot about was driving to work that morning to a team building day and getting the email that we'd been hacked and all my clients emailing me one-on-one and then my investors emailing me and the board of directors emailing me saying, did you mean to send me that email? They had all been sent personalized, very specific abuse about them at 4 a.m. in the morning from my business partner, and they made the emails look like it was meant to go to someone else, but it accidentally was sent to the CMO of the
I
NBA.
can't even cope
You know?
hearing you say it.
And as I arrived at paintballing that day, you have hundreds of people in my team that are all very excited because we're at paintballing. They don't know that they've just lost all their clients, and I'm 23 years old. So I have to tell them we'll jump in the cars, we're going to head back to the office, I need to chat to everybody. And then I spent all day in that glass box meeting room trying to resolve it. For me, I think we all have biases. Like, it's important to say that subject is subjective, but it's very real. You can put two people in the same situation, and one might pursue it as excitement, and the other might tell themselves a story that is anxiety. We all interpret the things that happen externally different internally. As we said earlier, the biggest unlocks for me and my business partner were I had a way of holding the controller as my default. He didn't. So he became an alcoholic, and he was drinking, as he's shared publicly, he's done a documentary on it, he was drinking in the laundry room in the house we lived in at 4 a.m. in the morning, had no idea what was going on with him. That behavior spiraled and spiraled and spiraled to the point where we met up to take his resignation. And in that meeting, for the first time ever, he turned to me and spoke about it. He told me what he'd been going through, the pain that he'd been hiding. And I remember on that Sunday afternoon in the office, him just crying and crying and crying. I just thought he was just damaging our company and our team. But it turned out he was someone that was suffering with something. And it changed my perspective on mental health and stress to, people that have those addictions and they're exhibiting that dysfunctional behavior. They're not doing that to destroy themselves. It's a last-ditch attempt to survive. And that's what it was for him. From that day onwards, the moment he shared it with me, started vocalizing his stress, it's been 8 years now, 9 years. He's never drank since that day. He went to therapy that day, and that changed his life. He's a marathon runner now, completely changed his perspective, but it also showed me the importance of the fact that I was bottling stuff up. I was hiding my stress. I did not believe that I could, as a CEO, stand in front of my company and tell them how I was feeling, ever. I didn't think I could tell anybody how I was feeling. I thought CEOs were these really tough things that would unfazed. And then learning about the science that it's leaking through my pores and that it's destroying me meant that I had to put systems in place and people that I can speak to when I'm stressed or something just can't get out of my mind so that I don't harm others and myself.
Yeah, and I think we all, and a lot of time we're not aware of this at all. We either respond to stress or we react to it. And I think most of the time we react because we're in the moment, we don't have the time, it's habitual, it's stuff we learned in childhood, but it is that moment where if we do, and I'm not saying this from a point of sort of sat here going, yeah, I do this all the time, but if we can stop and pause and go, I see what I'm doing here, I'm reacting to stress in a habitual way, and I've actually got a choice here to do this differently, because I think the more we react to stress, the more chance we have of ending up in that horrible bracket of chronic stress that you talked about, because we're just in a habit of doing it. And habits are really hard to break, but it's not impossible.
And it's important not to accept chronic stress as your default.
Yeah.
I, again, have had my mind changed on this by speaking to certain neuroscientists in particular, that if you think about most of the causes of the diseases that we suffer with that are caused by inflammation, oftentimes, chronic stress is the start of that, and it starts 20 years earlier as a seed, and it builds. And they can spot disease in your body 10 years out in many cases, and oftentimes, the amount of times that it's chronic stress is staggering to me. But I do think we've developed a bit of a culture that chronic stress is normality. And there's a difference, it's important. The distinction here is, of course, you should live your lives and we should all live our lives outside of our comfort zones. We should all be pushing ourselves. If you think about the framework I provided for loving your work earlier, the second thing I said was feeling sufficiently challenged. Because none of you would want to do the same video game on the same difficulty every single day. Daniel Pink, the motivation psychologist, said we need to ever-increasing challenges. If people have the same level of challenge in your company, they will quit. If they are too challenged, if they're overstressed, they will quit. It's that middle area called growth zone. And this is also linked slightly to imposter syndrome. Such a terrible phrase. Again, this is an example of a term which was created that because it has a medical ending, we immediately give it authority and think it's true. If you ever want to make someone believe something, just add a syndrome to it. Any medical terminology that comes with high authority, people will just believe the thing. So imposter syndrome has made us all think that it's a bad thing to be uncomfortable or to be doubtful in any situation. Like, I joined Dragon's Den and sat between Deborah Meaden and Peter Jones. Like, Peter Jones has been there for 21 years. Deborah Meaden's been there for 17. Of course, I'm like, what the hell am I doing in the TV? But also, I have the reflection that I would never choose a life without those feelings. I would never opt for a life that didn't get more increasingly difficult in terms of my aptitude or the depth in which I'm swimming.
Yeah, I think it's so important to talk about discomfort and what we can gain from it. And also, I think if we're constantly seeking comfort, and my podcast is called Happy Place. It's a really loaded title, and there's definitely some irony in there because that is not what I'm searching for. This just place of comfort and happiness. Because I think actually looking back at my past, the times I've learned the most, although I've hated it in the moment, have been the really challenging, uncomfortable times. They're probably the parts of me that I'm most proud of today, the times that I've really, really struggled. So I think if we keep pushing this notion that we've got to reach this destination of happiness in the future where we're just comfortable all the time, we're going to fall short every day. We go, oh, I didn't do it today. I didn't even do it at the end of this week. We're constantly falling short. So that discomfort piece is so important, that we're meant to feel all of it, bearing in mind we don't want to feel discomfort the whole time, which then goes chronic stress, chronic stress.
And if you think through the lens of a tribe again, we were never meant to feel it alone.
Yeah.
The worst kind of stress, as the studies show, the significant life study events where something bad has happened in your life, 30% less likely to die from all-cause mortality if you go through it with a supportive community. We're meant to struggle together.
Yeah.
And if you think about how this big arena sits here before us, it's because our ancestors, over many hundreds and thousands of years, they struggled forward together, taking on ever greater feats. So is it conceivable that that is hardwired into our genetic code? They left that there for us as well. They said, you two shall struggle forward together towards meaningful goals. That's a wiring. And if you think about, you take somebody and you put them in a room and you give them you give them completed goals. You say, there's nothing more for you to struggle towards. This is much of the challenge of AI. All your goals have completed, everything is done, give them unlimited money. They will lose motivation and engagement and they'll go into psychological decline. You give someone the cheat codes on a game, you remove all of their struggle, you remove the challenge from the game, they will lose motivation and go into psychological decline. The truth is, which is this uncomfortable paradox that sounds a little bit problematic when I say it, is that chaos is our stability. And total stability, when you have completed goals and nothing to strive for, is chaos. They call it gold medal depression. Olympians who win the medal or not come back from the Olympics and have a 70% higher chance of being depressed. Tyson Fury talks a lot about it. He says if he's not in training and he's not got something to aim at, he falls into depression. It's hardwired into us that we will struggle forward. And the bad thing is we're optimizing for comfort in really clear ways that aren't beneficial for humanity.
Yeah.
Living in 4 white walls in centrally heated homes and ordering my food on a glass screen alone is so far from being human. If there's anything my podcast has taught me, it's that all of the answers we're looking for are back there, like 10,000 years that way. And we've got to make this journey back to human. And there's a lot of people now thinking there will be a bit of a spiritual revolution, led by people like yourself and the work you've been doing over the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years, that will just take us back to being human, which means more connection, more time in nature, meaningful goals shared, living closer to each other, exercise. I mean, there's a reason why we're seeing the rise in ultra athletics and Ironman sports and high rocks, why that's become such a big industry. One of my investments this year on the Den is a 100-meter run in the mountains. Whole industry's booming because this comfort crisis, which we've created through the optimization of our lives, is innately unhuman.
Yeah, we've got to do something because we're in a right old mess, aren't we? We really are. We've got to do something about it. What I'd like to end on is a helpful book. We've both authored books and had a really jolly good time doing so, but I'm sure there'll be books out there that have been incredibly helpful to you. One book that I turn to regularly, it's something I'll dip in and out of, and I've read fully maybe 3 times now, is a beautiful book that I urge you all to get called The 4 Agreements, and it's by Don Miguel Ruiz. There's now, I think, a new edition. There's The 5 Agreements. The 4 Agreements are just fine. And I find the best book to read when I'm in self-loathing or in self-doubt or just feeling really discombobulated. It seems to instantly take me back to going, just be a bit nicer to yourself. I think this is one of the big keys for me with my own mental health is just being nice to myself. Stop turning on myself, beating myself up, acerbic words thrown at myself. It's just that kindness. So that book for me always gets me back there. How about you, Stephen?
Because of the subject matter we talked about, I'm going to say Johanna Hari's book, Lost Connections, which is just a wonderful investigation into why we feel the way we do from a mental health perspective and the real reasons, in his words, for the depression, the anxieties we're feeling. And it offers non-medical approaches to getting that connection back in our lives and goes through these amazing case studies all around the world of the power of these non-medical alternatives to making ourselves feel great that I think we've lost along the way somewhere. So that book changed my life. He's been on the podcast 3 times now, and he'll be on it 4 times soon. But yeah.
Well, I'm going to get that because I've not read it.
Yeah,
So
it changed my life.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Great. Book swap.
Okay, yeah.
Well, look, that just about wraps things up. Thank you so much for being here and for listening. Please, everyone, give it up for Stephen Bartlett.
Thank you. And Fearne Cotton.
Thank you.